The sun hung low over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of burnt orange and gold as the smell of roasted cornbread drifted from the small cabin's window. Clara stood in the kitchen, her hands busy kneading dough on the old wooden counter. The air was still, save for the soft hum that escaped her lips, a tune her mother used to sing when life was gentler and the world seemed kinder. She hummed it not for comfort, but out of habit, the only companion she had since her husband's passing 2 winters ago. Her life had become a series of quiet mornings and long evenings. The ranch was vast, and though she did her best to keep it running, loneliness had crept into the corners of her home like dust she couldn't sweep away. The neighbors had long stopped visiting, too far, too busy, and her heart had grown used to silence. But that evening, something changed. A tall man on horseback rode down the dirt path leading to her home. His shadow stretched across the field as he slowed near the gate. His name was Luke Carson, a cowboy known across the county for his quiet strength and the sorrow that hung in his eyes. He'd been riding for hours, his thoughts heavy with memories of his own, a brother lost in a stampede, a home that burned down, and dreams that turned to ash. He wasn't looking for company that day, he was just passing by when he heard it. That humming. Soft, fragile, yet powerful enough to pull him out of his thoughts. He stopped his horse, dismounted, and walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching on gravel. The melody floated out of the open window, wrapping around him like something familiar. He didn't mean to intrude, but the sound felt like a call he couldn't ignore. Inside, Clara didn't hear him approach. Her hands were covered in flour, her hair tucked behind her ear, and her mind far away in a memory of laughter by the fireplace. When she finally turned, she gasped, startled to see a stranger standing by her doorframe. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat respectfully. "Didn't mean to scare you. I was ridin' by and heard your tune. Been a while since I heard something that peaceful." Clara's heart thudded. No one had spoken to her like that in months. She wiped her hands on her apron and managed a small smile. "It's just an old song. My mama used to sing it. It's a fine song," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that didn't match the cold outside. "Makes a man forget the world for a moment." She offered him a chair. "You look like you could use some supper. I've got stew on the stove." He hesitated. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers anymore. But something about her presence, calm, steady, and so achingly human, made him nod. "That'd be mighty kind of you." As the stew simmered and the scent of herbs filled the room, the two sat at the wooden table, the fire crackling beside them. Conversation came slow at first, broken by silences that weren't uncomfortable. He spoke of the road, of cattle drives and nights under the stars. She spoke of her garden, her baking, and the long winters she endured alone. Somewhere between laughter and quiet, they realized how much they'd missed simply being heard. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the window panes. Luke looked at her, the glow of the fire catching in his eyes. "You live out here alone?" She nodded. "Been that way for a while. My husband, he passed 2 years back." He lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry. Lost family myself. Feels like the world takes the ones who make it worth living." Clara's voice softened. "Maybe it's the world's way of seeing if we can still keep on living, even when we think we can't." He looked at her then, really looked. Her face wasn't young, but it was beautiful in a quiet way, lined with stories of pain and endurance. And in that moment, something in him stirred, something he thought was gone forever. When supper ended, he stood, thanking her for the meal. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said gently. "There's danger in these parts, wolves, or worse, men with no sense of decency." Clara smiled faintly. "I've faced worse things than wolves, Mr. Carson. But thank you for your concern." He lingered at the door, his hand brushing the frame. The night air was cold, yet he didn't want to leave. "Would you mind if I came by again sometime? Maybe help you with them fences I saw breakin' down near the pasture?" Her lips curved. "If you don't mind my humming while you work." He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. "Wouldn't mind it one bit." Days turned into weeks, and true to his word, Luke came back. At first, he helped her with chores, fixing the roof, mending fences, chopping wood. But gradually, the reasons changed. He came not for the work, but for the peace he found sitting by her kitchen table, listening to her hum while stirring a pot or folding bread dough. He brought her wildflowers from the hills, stories from his travels, and a quiet companionship that filled the lonely corners of her life. In return, she brought him something he didn't know he was missing, a sense of home. One evening, after a long day repairing the barn, they sat on the porch, the sky alive with stars. Clara's voice broke the silence. "You ever think life gives us second chances?" He smiled faintly. "I stopped believing in those a long time ago." She turned toward him, her eyes steady. "Maybe you just never recognized one when it came." The air hung thick between them. Luke's heart felt something it hadn't in years, hope. The kind that didn't come from fortune or adventure, but from the simple presence of another soul who saw him as more than a wanderer. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. The world around them seemed to fade. No wind, no sound, just two hearts remembering what it meant to feel alive again. From that day forward, he stopped riding past her cabin. Instead, he stayed, not because he was needed, but because he wanted to be. The woman who hummed alone in her kitchen had unknowingly called him home with her song. And the cowboy who once only chased the horizon finally found something worth stopping for. Winter came earlier that year, dressing the hills in white and quieting the sounds of the valley. The ranch looked almost like a painting, smoke curling from the chimney, the barn door creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the fire crackled, throwing golden light across the walls, and Luke sat at the table sharpening a small pocketknife, his hat resting beside him. Clara moved about the kitchen, humming the same tune that had first stopped him months ago. Life had settled into something beautiful, something simple, yet neither of them dared to name it. They worked side by side, spoke without needing to fill every silence, and shared small moments that meant more than grand words ever could. Luke would rise early to feed the horses, while Clara prepared breakfast, biscuits, eggs, and coffee that smelled like warmth itself. Sometimes, Luke caught himself watching her, the way her hands moved gracefully when she kneaded dough, or the way her eyes softened when she looked out at the pasture. He'd known many women in his life, some kind, some cruel, most passing through like dust in the wind, but Clara was different. She had no need to impress, no desire for anything more than what was real. She was content with the little she had, and that quiet contentment drew him closer every day. One morning, the two stood outside repairing a broken fence. When the clouds began to gather, the air grew sharp, and the wind carried the scent of snow. Luke looked up. "We best get inside soon. That sky's got a storm brewing." Clara nodded, pushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I'll finish this part, just a few more nails." But before she could drive another, a cold gust blew her hat away, sending it tumbling across the field. Luke laughed softly and went running after it. When he returned, his hair dusted with flakes, he placed the hat gently back on her head. "Can't have you catching cold now," he said with a grin. "Thank you," she murmured, meeting his gaze for a moment longer than either of them intended. That night, as snow piled against the door, Luke helped her bring in extra firewood. They ate dinner in comfortable silence until Clara broke it. "It's been a long time since anyone stayed through a storm with me," she said quietly. Luke looked into the fire. "Maybe it's time someone did." The way he said it, steady, without hesitation, made her heart stir. For years, she'd convinced herself that companionship was behind her. Yet here was a man, roughened by the road but gentle in spirit, sitting in her kitchen like he belonged there. They spent the next few days snowed in. Luke read aloud from an old book he found on the shelf, his deep voice filling the room, while Clara mended clothes or baked bread. He even tried helping her cook once, though it ended in laughter when he burned the biscuits. "I guess I'm better with horses than with ovens," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck in embarrassment. Clara chuckled, handing him another tray. "Everyone's got to start somewhere, cowboy." It was during those snowbound days that they truly came to know each other, not through grand gestures, but through small, ordinary moments that built trust like steady rain fills a well. Luke told her stories from his travels, sleeping under the stars, facing storms out on the plains, losing men to the unforgiving land. Clara listened, her eyes filled with quiet empathy. Then one evening, while the snow fell soft and steady outside, Luke shared something he hadn't told anyone before. "My brother's gone because of me," he said, staring into the flames. "We were driving cattle across the canyon when the storm hit. I told him to cross the ridge, thought it'd be quicker. The ground gave way. I've been carrying that ever since." Clara reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. You didn't mean for it to happen, Luke. Some things aren't ours to control. He met her eyes, seeing no judgment there, only understanding. Still feels like my fault. Maybe it always will, she said softly, but maybe you're here now because you were meant to find peace somewhere. Maybe that's what he'd want for you. Her words struck deep. For the first time in years, the ache in his chest eased, replaced by a fragile kind of hope. As the days passed, the storm lifted, but neither spoke about him leaving. He repaired her barn doors, helped dig new paths through the snow, and fixed the roof where the wind had torn away shingles. When spring came, the valley bloomed again, and with it came something neither of them could deny any longer. One afternoon, while Clara was tending to her garden, Luke came over carrying a small box he'd made from cedar wood. He handed it to her without a word. Inside was a small silver locket, old and worn but polished clean. It was my mother's, he said quietly. She gave it to me when I left home. Said I'd know who to give it to when I met someone who felt like home. Clara's breath caught. Luke, he shook his head gently. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know what you mean to me. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked down at the locket. No one's ever given me something like this before. He smiled faintly. That's because no one's seen you the way I do. The days that followed were tender, filled with stolen glances and soft laughter. They weren't young lovers swept up in passion, theirs was something deeper, quieter, built from shared loneliness that had finally found its match. One evening, they rode out together across the pasture, the golden light spilling over the fields. Clara hadn't ridden in years, but Luke saddled the gentlest mare for her and guided her slowly. She laughed, her hair loose in the wind, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt alive. When they stopped near the creek, Luke dismounted and helped her down. The world was still around them, just the rustle of grass and the murmur of water. I used to think the road was where I belonged, he said, gazing out at the horizon. But lately, when I think about home, I don't see a place. I see you, standing by that stove, humming that song. Clara felt her throat tighten. You've given me more life these past months than I thought I'd ever feel again. But I'm afraid, Luke. Afraid it's too good to last. He turned to her, his voice steady. Then let's not waste what we've got left wondering if it will. Life's too short for what ifs. She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. You always know what to say. I just know what I feel, he said, brushing a thumb against her cheek. As spring turned into summer, Luke began helping more around the ranch, treating it as if it were his own. The locals noticed, word spread that Clara wasn't alone anymore, that the quiet cowboy had found his place. Some gossiped, some smiled, but neither of them paid it any mind. They worked hard, side by side under the sun, their bond deepening with every passing day. Sometimes, he'd sneak up behind her while she was hanging laundry, wrapping his arms around her waist and whispering, "That song's stuck in my head again." And she'd laugh, leaning into him. "Then I guess you'll just have to stay till it stops." But peace, as always, never lasts forever. One late afternoon, a rider came from town, a sheriff's deputy. He brought news of a land dispute near the neighboring ranch, one that Luke had been unknowingly tied to from years ago. A man he'd once worked for had accused him of theft, an old lie that had followed him across counties. The deputy handed him a paper and said he'd need to come into town to clear his name. Clara stood by the porch, worry written on her face. Is it serious? Luke folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. It's just old trouble catching up. I'll set it straight. When will you be back? Soon, he promised. You'll see me ride up before that kettle cools. But days turned to weeks, and no word came. Clara tried to keep busy, tending to chores, humming her tune, pretending her heart wasn't aching. Each evening, she'd look down the road, hoping to see that familiar figure on horseback. One stormy night, she sat by the fire when she heard hooves outside. She rushed to the door, and there he was, soaked to the bone, but alive. She ran to him, tears streaming down her cheeks. Luke, I thought. He pulled her close, holding her tight. Took longer than I thought, but I'm here. It's over now. Cleared my name for good. The relief in her eyes was enough to undo him. He kissed her, slow, certain, like a promise. That night, as the rain fell, they sat by the fire with hands entwined. No words were needed, the silence between them said everything. Months later, under the warm blush of autumn, Luke asked her to walk with him to the old oak tree behind the barn. There, beneath the same sky that had once held their loneliness, he took her hand. "Clara," he said softly, "I've spent my whole life running from ghosts. But when I found you, I stopped running. You made me want to stay, to build something real." Her eyes shimmered. "You already have, Luke. You gave me back a life I thought I'd buried." He knelt down, not with grand ceremony, but with quiet sincerity. "Then let's build the rest together. If you'll have me." For a moment, her breath caught, the world narrowing to just the sound of wind through the trees. Then she smiled, tears spilling freely. "Yes, Luke, I'll have you." When he slipped the simple silver ring onto her finger, one he'd made himself from a piece of old horseshoe, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing them in golden light. From that day on, the cabin no longer felt empty. Laughter filled its rooms, the scent of bread and stew mingled with the sound of soft humming, and the ranch that had once echoed with silence now pulsed with life. Luke would often pause while working, just to listen, to the wind, the creak of the barn door, and her voice singing that familiar tune. And every time he did, he remembered the first day he'd heard it, when a cowboy stopped on a lonely road and found the one thing he never thought he'd have again, a reason to stay. Years later, the locals still spoke of the woman who used to hum alone in her kitchen and the cowboy who stopped when he heard her song. They said their love wasn't built on grand gestures or perfect moments, but on quiet mornings, shared burdens, and the courage to begin again after loss. And long after their hands had grown old, the cabin remained, warm light spilling from its windows, a faint hum always drifting into the evening air, the melody that had once brought two lost souls together and never let them go.